We're going to talk today about a verse that is probably familiar to most of us. Our title today is All of Us. I thought I would try to sneak in on you about what our verse was, but it leaked out anyway. Because sometimes we have verses that are familiar and we're preloaded towards them. But I want us to dig into this verse a little bit. In Mark chapter 12, it also occurs in other Gospels. But Jesus is asked, what is the most important commandment? Now that seems like an odd question, but he has to, they ask him to pick the most important commandment out of all the Bible. And this is his answer. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." Now that's a daunting verse in some ways. So what are we going to look at today and talk about? This is obviously a well-known command. It's not just well-known to us. It was very well-known and familiar to the Jews. This was something that they, if they were doing as they were expected, they recited every morning and every night. I don't know if you have a verse that you're that familiar with, but that was what they did. And so we're going to talk about what their familiarity with, and then we're going to talk about these ideas of heart, mind, soul, and strength. What do those mean? What do those mean in the verse? What do they mean to us? How do we make sense of that? And then we're going to talk about an ask and an offer. I'll explain that when we get to it at the end. And we're going to close out talking about a love that we can trust. So let's dig in and look at this well-known command. How do you feel when you hear this verse? When you hear somebody read this verse or talk about this verse, I think there's a lot of different ways we can feel about it. All is an intimidating word. If somebody asks you, have you done all you can do? Have you really given it your all? It's hard, I think, for us to say, oh, yes, absolutely. It's an intimidating. Jesus uses a lot of these kind of intimidating words. He says, if you want to follow me, you've got to give up everything. Ooh, everything? I mean, I'm willing to give up lots of stuff, but I got to give up everything? That's an intimidating word. All is an intimidating word. Jesus has a habit of using these kind of words, but, that's what's in the command is all. And so love him with all your heart. Is it a performance test? See, I think this is where we start to get into conflict about this verse. We read that we need to love God with all of our heart. And then we start doing self-evaluation. Well, let's see, that's 100% all. How am I doing on that? Am I really loving God with all of my heart? What about last Tuesday, that situation? I don't think that was, maybe I'm at 60%. Maybe I'm at 70%. Maybe I'm feeling really good this week and I'm up to 85. But man, 100%, that's a high bar. Can I really say I love God with all my heart? Okay, but he doesn't stop there. Then he says, well, he goes into other stuff. He goes into mind and soul, and how do I even evaluate whether I'm loving God with all my soul? I'm still trying to figure out what that is. And so, how do I know if I'm loving him with all of that and with all my strength? How much strength do I have? What does that mean? If I start evaluating the verse and myself in this kind of a way, this verse becomes very overwhelming. I don't know if I can really say I'm loving God with all, I start to feel guilty and squeamish as I look at this verse if I think that way. This verse is actually a very encouraging verse if we understand it. So I hope that we'll understand it a little bit different as we go along today. We're going to spend some time talking about how the Jews heard this verse and how it's really presented in the scriptures, because I think this is really important. This verse comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. Now, I would ask you to turn over there and read it, but we just read it and it says the same thing, almost. And so I won't ask you to do that. But in Deuteronomy chapter 6:4, they're given this verse. There's one thing that's interesting in the verse in Deuteronomy chapter 4. It doesn't say mind. It says heart, soul, and strength, but not mind. Well, why is that? Well, the reason why that's true is because there really wasn't a Hebrew word that shared that idea that we think about as mind. We tend to separate heart and mind into two different things. In Jewish thought and in the Hebrew language, those things weren't separated. And so there's no mind in the Old Testament version because it's incorporated in the idea of heart. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But so there's no mind in that version. By the time you get to Jesus' time, you've got the Greek influence. And so there's this idea, to capture the idea in the Greek language, you have to have both of those elements there. But in the Old Testament, there was just heart. There wasn't a mind there. This is referred to as a prayer or a command that is called the Shema. And it's a very important part. And I'm going to take risk here and talk to you about some Hebrew words that I'm probably going to mispronounce. So if you're an expert in Hebrew language, please have mercy on me if I don't get this right. But it starts out, "Hear, O Israel." That's the first words of it. This word, Shema, means listen or hear. That's why it's translated that way. Jared alluded to this in his communion. I didn't know he was going to do this, but he did some of my work for me. We separate this idea of hearing from listening. And we go further than that. We separate the idea of listening from obeying. So, and parents will get this idea maybe more clearly than other people. We say something to our children, okay? We say, "Go clean your room." Okay, so the first threshold when we tell our kids, "Go clean your room," is, did they hear me? It's amazing how poorly their hearing can be affected whenever you're asking them to clean their room. You can go in a remote part of the house and whisper quietly in the dark that we might go to McDonald's and get some French fries and chicken nuggets, and they'll come running from where they are because they heard you. But when you say clean their room, they say, "Oh, I didn't hear you." Okay, so that's the first level. Did you hear me? Then the second level is, did you process? Did you listen? Did you understand what I said? That's part of hearing. And then the third level is, if you tell your kid to go clean their room, they may have heard you, they may have listened to you, but that doesn't mean the room's clean yet. Taylor's laughing back there. I don't know why. Maybe this is touching the nerve. But did I obey? Did I actually go clean the room? So the parent has this idea that I'm going to say, "Go clean your room," and an hour later I'm going to walk in there and it's going to be neat and orderly, and I'm going to get to say, "Great job, thank you for doing that." Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. And guess what? It's not just parents and kids. That happens with us and God. And so this prayer starts out here. This is an interesting notion. In the Hebrew language, the idea of listening included obedience. There was no variation where you listened but you didn't obey. If you didn't obey, you didn't listen. And so that's why Jesus, when he was teaching parables, what did I do? Hit the back button? Nope, I hit the forward button. That's why Jesus, whenever he was teaching in parables, he said, "They have ears to hear. They have ears, but they don't hear. They don't listen." He meant they hear the words, but they're not obeying. So true listening always included obedience. Again, as I said, they did this every morning and evening. So this was very, very familiar to them. Okay, let's get into some details. First of all, the idea of heart. This word in Hebrew is lev. That's what the word is in Hebrew. So what is it? What do they mean when they say heart? Well, heart had to do with, literally, it's the chest or the core, what's inside. But what the word meant in the way that it was being talked about here is the inner man or woman, what you are on the inside. That's what heart is. And so it involves a lot of things. It involves intellect, it involves character, it involves conscience, it involves will, it involves intention. All the things that go on inside of you that other people, when they sit and look at you while you're sitting on your chair, say, I wonder what he's thinking. Well, that's heart, the part that people can't see. What's inside of you? The idea of heart included feelings. Now, when we think heart, that's primarily what we think about. We think about how I feel. That in the Hebrew, and certainly a lot of feelings were included in this idea of heart in the Hebrew word that we're talking about, but not all of them. A lot of feelings were actually associated with the bowels. That would make it hard for the greeting card people. That's all I'm going to say about that. Like compassion and mercy and tenderness, that was viewed as your lower abdomen had those feelings, but the heart had a lot of feelings. So the heart is very encompassing. It deals with what is inside of us. The idea is this is not just some external form that we're dealing with God. It's a genuine love. It's the person inside loving God with all of what's inside of me is what we're really talking about here. Okay, so let's move on to the second one. Soul. This is maybe the hardest one. Soul in Hebrew is nephesh. It involves the idea of throat or breath. Oddly enough, in Jewish thought, this had to do a lot with your physicality, not just the inside part of you. Soul was your breath, your substance. Life can't exist without it. I mean, you think about your throat and both air, all of your substance and all of your air goes through there. So how long do you last if your throat is not intact? I mean, it's a famous gesture that everybody understands and you can get a penalty for in football, if you do this. The idea is your life is over. You don't exist anymore if that's not there. You cannot survive. So it represents physical life, but because of that, it represents a person. Because it represents your life, it represents you, your soul. It's used for more than just physical things. In Psalm 42, 1 through 2, it says, as a deer pants for water, so I long for God. So it takes a physical thing and uses it to make a spiritual application. That's, if you want to understand John chapter 15, when Jesus is talking about the vine and the branches, there's a verse in there that we don't like sometimes. He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. And we don't like that, because we like to feel self-sufficient. Well, what he's telling us is, if you're cut off from your source of everything, you can no longer function. Spiritually, we can't do anything if we have lost our connection to our life and breath and our sustenance. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about soul. We're talking about my life. So love God with all your life. Interestingly, this whole idea of, we have a somewhat developed picture about how things work in eternity, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But we have the idea that the soul is inside of our body, and in Greek thought, the soul was almost trapped in the body, and it escaped at death. But we don't think that way so much. But we have the idea that my real soul is something that is beyond my body. But the Jews didn't really have that developed very well. It was a very divisive and controversial idea whether there was even life after death. You had the Sadducees who were sure that, yes, that was not true. And then you had the Pharisees that said, oh, yes, there is a resurrection. But it wasn't very developed, and they argued about it all the time. And they really didn't have that concept down. Most of what we understand and know about that, and a lot of what Jesus talked about, was about life after death, and that was real. And there was a judgment, and there was heaven, and we could be with God forever. Those are great ideas that are very important that Jesus really developed and revealed to us. But to them, the idea of soul was your life. It's who you were. It's what kept you going. So love God with all of that. Lastly was the idea of strength. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but there's the word in Hebrew. Now, interestingly, this is not talking about how strong you are. I was going to pick somebody out in the crowd that is really strong and mention their name, but I won't do that. We think of strong, we think of muscular and powerful, or maybe you have an incredible presence and people just, they rally to you because you're such a strong person. That's not what this is talking about. It's almost a modifier, an amplifier. It's talking about abundance, having much, doing something richly, doing it to a great degree, doing it strongly. There is actually a word in Hebrew for physical strength. That's it there. Kach, I think is how you pronounce it. And so, that's strength. But this is not that word. This is the best. It's an amplifier for in the creation account. God says this was good, this was good, this was good, this was good. And then at the end he says it's very good. That very is this word. So when we talk about loving God with our strength, we're talking about loving God abundantly, loving God richly. A lot of commentaries talk about loving God muchly. That's not really a word, but you get the idea. Doing it generously. So that's in fact on the idea of generosity. As time went on, this word was often used to talk about our wealth. And so loving God with our wealth was tied to this idea. So it was used in a lot of different ways. But that's what we're talking about when we're talking about loving God with our strength. It's an indication of intensity. It's not just that God wants all of the stuff and God wants all of our energy. He wants us to love Him intensely. He wants us to love Him. He wants it to be very good, not just good. So that's what they mean. So here's the thing. How do we decide which things go into which category? Well, here's what I'll tell you. Don't get too caught up in which one is which. And I'll explain why in a minute. But let me give you an example. Let's say you go to the grocery store. Okay? Now, I asked my wife if I could borrow some of her grocery bags for this picture. Okay, so she's saving the planet, as you can see on the bags there. She uses these recyclable or these reusable grocery bags. I get in trouble because I go to the store and I forget to take them, and then I come home with the plastic ones. But she's saving the planet, doing good things. So she takes them to the store and she puts them on the counter, and they put the groceries in them. All right. Now, here's the thing. Maybe there's some strategy that you think is a good strategy of how the groceries should be bagged. You want the produce in one bag, and you want the canned goods over here. Don't put the eggs on the bottom, please. That's not a good idea. These things seem to evade many baggers, I've noticed. But we have a strategy of how we think stuff ought to be bagged. And so here we got 4 bags: heart, mind, soul, and strength. And certain things are supposed to go in certain bags, right? Here's the real story, though. As long as all the stuff I paid for gets to the house, in one of those bags, I'm okay. All right? That's the main issue, is I want my stuff to get home. So here's what I'll tell you about our story, is it includes everything. Everything's in one of those bags. We need to love God with our heart, with our mind, with our soul, with our strength. That incorporates everything about us. Now, let me ask you a couple of questions. Who do you love in this way? Let's set God aside for the moment. Who do you love in this way? Who do you love with your whole being? Who do you love with the essence of your life? Who do you love abundantly and richly? Who do you love with your mind, with what you think about? How many people, that's probably a pretty small list, right? And so think about that as we go along. I think maybe our spouse, our kids, maybe our very closest friends, that we love that way. Now here's a harder question. Who do you expect to receive this love from? Who do you expect to love you that way? I suspect that that list is even shorter. That list is even shorter. This is an all-in kind of love. It's a no-holds-barred kind of love. So who do you expect that from? Who do you give it to? So let's talk about the ask and the offer. Be honest, there's only one person that I expect this kind of love from. She's in the sound booth back there. Okay? Now, I'd like to tell you that I expect this kind of total, all-encompassing love from my children. But, it doesn't always work out that way. I mean, I know they love me, and it's going to work out eventually. But if you've had kids, sometimes it works better than others, and, you love them that way, but they don't always respond in kind. But I expect that from her. Is that unreasonable? Here's the thing. I expect it from her, but I demand it from myself towards her. I wouldn't expect it or ask from her if I wasn't giving it to her. Look, Betsy may not get much, but she gets all I've got. All right? I mean, maybe you think, Randy, you are getting the better end of that bargain, and I won't disagree with you. But I'm not holding back from her. She's getting everything I have to give, such as it is. Okay? Now, Jesus said something interesting in Luke chapter 11, verse 11 through 13. Let's look over there real quick. Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, would give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, would give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? So Jesus says, look, you're evil, and you know how to give good gifts to your children. So what has that got to do with what we're talking about? Here's the thing. If I, as a person who is sinful, would never expect someone to give that love to me unless I was first giving it to them. And I'm sinful. How do you think that goes with God? What I'm telling you is what God is asking from us, He's giving to us. He asks us to love Him with all of our heart. And He does that because He loves us with all of His heart. He asks us to love Him. In the New Testament, talks about loving Him with all of our mind. He's loving us with all of His mind. He's bending everything He has toward us in love. He asks us to love Him with our soul, the essence of who we are. He's loving us that way first. He asks us to love Him with all of our strength, to love Him richly and abundantly and in a strong way. He's doing that for us first. He's asking, but He's also offering. God is all in. He always has been all in. He's not asking us to do something He's not doing. He's asking us to join in what He has always been doing towards us. This is about relationship more than performance. You know, we tend to grade on a percentage. How am I doing in this? He's inviting us into an all-in relationship with Him, where we're fully committed to Him and He is fully committed to us. You know, that's why a marriage works, is because both people are completely committed to one another. And if it's not like that, you got to work on that. But that's what God is offering to us as He asks us these things. God is calling us to a fully committed, intimate relationship with Him. That's what this verse is really about. I want to close out talking about a love that we can trust. Turn over to John chapter 14. Say, he's going to read that verse again? Yes, I am. I read this verse a lot because I like it a lot. John chapter 14, verse 23. Says, Jesus replied, "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching." We're back to that listening idea again. "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them." Do you see what God is talking about with us? He's talking about, and Jesus goes on here to talk about the Spirit who's going to be given so that He can live inside of us and so that God can be inside of us. Look, I love Betsy and I love our relationship, but, I'm not with her all the time. She goes off to work, I go off to work. She goes this place, I go that place. I'm with her a lot, but I'm not with her all the time. And, some day is going to come when one of us is not going to be with the other one. That happens in life. That's the way things are. God says, I'm going to make my home inside of you, to be with you always. 24/7, every day, for the rest of your life and through all eternity. That's what He's offering. This is a love that lasts forever. It's a love that is trustworthy. Look over in Revelation chapter 21. We'll read a few verses there. Revelation 21 will start in verse 1. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. You know, God wants a love with us that lasts for eternity, where he lives with us and among us, and we are his people for eternity. And he gives us his Spirit to live inside us as a deposit for the day that that's going to come into being. That's what he's offering us. As we close, let me ask you a couple questions. Are we all in with God? Are you and I all in with God? That's what he's really asking for. Am I all in with God, or am I holding back in some way? You know, in marriage isn't any fun if you live in marriage holding back and not being all in. It doesn't work. If you're all in, it's a great thing. It's the same thing with the relationship to God. It's not about going to church and avoiding certain behaviors and doing this and doing that and, you know, having a list of things that you check off that you do and don't do. It's about being in love with God and giving him all you have and all you are. But when you do that, understand that he got there first and he's giving you everything he has. You know, like we talked about before, we are getting the good end of the bargain. God gives far more than he gets. And we should always remember that. He never asks anything from us that he's not far exceeding what he gives in return. You know, we need to give God all of us and enjoy the fact that he's given us all of himself. That's what makes life as a disciple special. That's what makes this room special, is when we're a group of people who are giving all we have to God and enjoying that close relationship. Hope this has helped you. Thanks for being here, and we're going to close out with a song.